and when you get into sort of the more regulatory stuff, which, again, above my pay grade, right? This is why you're here. Do you know Derek Thompson from The Atlantic? He had a great article going back. I mean, it's probably a year old now, but talking about like local barriers for development, and he sort of put the housing shortage on NIMBYism, right? So well-known term, and I was hoping you could tell us what does the NIMBY acronym mean? We don't have to we're not throwing down the gauntlet here with the older generation or anything like that. But what does that acronym mean? And if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, anytime I can talk shit on boomers, it makes me really happy. But
let it rip, Mallory. NIMBY, let it rip.
So NIMBY means not in my backyard. And it's a common refrain among like developers, urban planners, like basically anyone who's in kind of like the built environment space. I have some hatred of the term to some extent because I focus a lot on community engagement in my job. And I do think that like we need to listen better to communities and help them have kind of like a true participatory effort and be part of the process and in terms of shaping like how their communities are built up around them. And I get like in Marshfield, I mean, when I go back to Marshfield, even I'm like, well, this is different. And I don't like that it's different. There's a ton of like nostalgia and emotion built in there that's just a natural part of being a human. So I get
Definitely.
it. But where NIMBYism is a threat is when it's tied to people's obsession with property values and also like kind of a misguided understanding of how things like multifamily housing development and especially true affordable housing development, meaning housing that's priced at certain levels so it's affordable to like people like retail workers, service workers. That's where NIMBYism becomes really dangerous. And especially in a lot of communities, especially small towns and cities, a lot of times wealthy homeowners are given kind of this outsized influence over what happens in government. And so that's where this gets really scary and counterproductive.
Yeah. And it seems like one of the reasons it's a problem, like being so pro-development is almost like a losing policy issue, it seems, at least politically, and I do see this. I agree with what you're saying, right? Where like you totally understand wanting your town or your community to not change too dramatically, to keep its identity. And I respect the sentiment. But at the same time, right, I believe there's sort of like a higher calling and a higher responsibility here. We have an issue where, the ability to buy your own home is sort of off the table for a lot of people, right? And you mentioned earlier, like stagnant wage growth, rapid inflation, right? Like wages, I guess technically they're up, but not with inflation. I mean, they're down in real terms, and a cost of living that prevents people from ever getting into the market. Do you ever see that? Just because you were talking about like people being overly concerned with property values. Did you ever see that HBO show Show Me a Hero with Oscar Isaac? You ever see that one? It's great. It's like a 6-episode miniseries, but it's really about sort of like a case, like an affordable housing development in Yonkers, and the community really came out against it, and they were essentially going to be bankrupt. It's a whole thing. I won't get into it now, but for you and anybody listening, it's definitely worth checking it out. I think the way I frame it is like, development. It's not like, we all know like development. It's not charity. I hate when you hear like, look what we're doing. This is a service to the community. Like, hold on, it's a for-profit enterprise, right? Like, don't flatter yourself, right? Like, good for you if you run a very philanthropic business or whatever, but it's not charity. I say that, the same thing about, brokers, right? Like, I genuinely do care about my clients, their money. I want them to win. I want to be a good teammate, right? But
ultimately you're making money.
I'm getting paid for this. I'm getting paid for this, right? Not directly for this podcast, but and I do want to help people, and I do, but clearly I'm getting paid to do the job. But I think on the development, like, I think I would be, maybe you'd agree with this. Like, I think I'm like pro development, but sort of like anti-developer sometimes,
Yeah.
Is that, maybe it's like an oversimplification. I'd be just interested in your thoughts.
No, I think that's a good way of phrasing it. Yeah, I think it's sort of like you want to give the community the ability to shape kind of the overarching goals of their community and what they want their community to be like and look like. And I think that there's room to do that on the design side. I mean, speaking about zoning and regulation, there are reasons why we have those things. I mean, back in the post-industrial era, you were having like factories built right next to like tenement buildings. And so there was literally like health and safety concerns, fire.
Oh yeah, I wanted you to get into exactly. Sort of the history of zoning. Yeah.
So I think like that's the history of zoning, is really just a true separation of like uses that are dangerous from residential uses, so people can have clean air and not have to worry about like fire separation and just kind of these basic things that you need to promote, like just a general understanding of human safety and quality of life. But local governments kind of got greedy with like how specific they can get with regulating development. And I think that's where some of the danger comes from. And a lot of zoning regulations since the early 20th century have really been a way to keep poor people out, keep certain races out of communities. Like you had mentioned in our conversation earlier about a lot of states had enacted single family zoning, which is a zoning practice where in certain neighborhoods, you can only have single family homes. And in California, in Oregon, and Washington, in parts of Massachusetts, like in a lot of areas, you had the only residential product that could be developed was single family homes. And really the only reason why that was propagated is because of racism. So like keeping Black people out of communities, like classism, keeping poor people out of communities. So that's kind of the origin story of a lot of these regulations. And so I think a lot of them are super counterproductive, and we're starting to see kind of the boiling point of that. And that's why a lot of states like California, Oregon, Washington, along the West Coast are sort of leaders in eradicating single family only zoning and allowing for more multifamily development to come in. But despite the fact that we're living in a quote unquote post-racism society, which we're not, and a post-classism society, which we're also not, you are seeing a lot of neighborhoods and communities like really pushing against the eradication of these zoning regulations simply because of classism thinly veiled by like my property value will go down